The cafe was small but full of warmth. The wooden floors creaked a little under every step, and the faint smell of coffee and fresh pastries floated through the air. It was the kind of place where regulars felt at home, where the barista knew your favorite drink, and where strangers often became friends after a few visits. Among the staff, there was a young waitress who moved quietly but with purpose. She wasn't flashy or loud. She didn't wear fancy clothes, and she didn't demand attention. Yet there was something about the way she carried herself that made people notice her. Even if they didn't know why, she had been working at the cafe for a few years, and over time, the regulars had grown used to seeing her cheerful face every day. She served coffee, cleared tables, and smiled at everyone she passed. To the people in the cafe, she was just another hard-working waitress, friendly but ordinary. They didn't know her story, and they certainly didn't know that her life outside the cafe was full of challenges. Her days were long. She arrived early in the morning, even before the cafe opened, to help set up. She cleaned tables, washed dishes, and made sure everything was ready for the customers. Sometimes she skipped meals just to save a little extra money. Life wasn't easy, but she carried it quietly without complaint. What kept her going was simple, a love for music. Even though she couldn't afford formal lessons or a grand piano at home, she practiced whenever she could. Her small apartment had a tiny keyboard, and sometimes she would play late into the night when the apartment was silent. Music was her escape. It was the one place where she felt free, where the weight of life didn't press so heavily on her shoulders. One evening, the cafe decided to host a small talent night. It wasn't anything fancy, just a chance for the regulars to enjoy some music and for anyone brave enough to perform to show their skills. The host walked around with a microphone, joking with the crowd. Who wants to show off their talent tonight? Don't be shy. People laughed and cheered. Some were confident, some were nervous, and some were just there for fun. The waitress stayed in the background, refilling drinks and serving desserts. She kept her head down, thinking it wasn't her place to perform. After all, she was just a waitress, and no one expected her to do anything more than bring coffee and clean tables. But as the host glanced around, he noticed her. With a playful grin, he called out, "How about you? Come on, why don't you give it a try?" She froze. The cafe went quiet for a moment, all eyes on her. Some people chuckled softly, thinking it would be funny to see a waitress try to perform on stage. She shook her head quickly, wanting to escape the attention. "No, thank you," she said softly. But the host, smiling and teasing, wouldn't let her off the hook. "Come on, don't be shy. It'll be fun," he said. The audience started clapping, encouraging her. Some regulars whispered, "It'll be interesting to see her try," while others laughed quietly, thinking they were about to see something entertaining. In a teasing kind of way, her heart raced and her stomach twisted with nerves. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the thought of everyone staring at her made her want to run. Yet there was something deep inside that whispered, "Maybe this is my chance." She glanced at the piano in the corner. It looked ordinary, but in her mind it was like a bridge to another world, a world where she could be herself, where she could express everything she felt without saying a word. After a few tense moments, she sighed quietly and walked toward the piano. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the cover and placed her fingers on the keys. The crowd watched, expecting a small, clumsy performance, maybe a few random notes that wouldn't make sense. Some people smirked, thinking they were about to witness a mistake. She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and tried to calm the rapid beating of her heart. She didn't know if she could play in front of all these people. She hadn't performed publicly before. But as soon as her fingers touched the keys, something shifted inside her. The nervousness didn't disappear entirely, but it became a spark, a fuel for focus. She reminded herself that she had practiced countless nights alone in her tiny apartment. She knew the piano. She knew the music. Now, all that remained was to let it flow. The cafe was silent. Even the clinking of cups and murmurs of conversation seemed to fade. All eyes were on her, waiting. She could feel the weight of expectations, the quiet doubts, and the laughter that had been whispered just moments ago. And then she began to play. As she sat at the piano, the cafe went completely quiet. The dim lights above cast soft shadows across the room, and the scent of coffee seemed to fade into the background. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and for a moment she felt frozen. The laughter and teasing whispers from a few moments ago still echoed in her mind. Some people were already shaking their heads or smirking, certain that this would be a funny, awkward moment. A few of the regulars whispered among themselves. "I wonder if she even knows a single song," one said. Another chuckled quietly, nudging a friend. "This is going to be interesting." The host smiled from the side, sensing the nervous tension in the room and thinking that the audience would get a good laugh. It was clear that almost everyone assumed she would fail, as she could feel the weight of their doubt pressing down on her dot. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on the keys. The first few seconds were the hardest. She could hear her own heartbeat, fast and uneven. She remembered all the nights she had spent practicing alone, her fingers moving across the small keyboard in her apartment, trying to perfect every note. Those late nights when the world was silent except for the soft sound of her music had been her escape, her comfort, her secret. She thought of those moments and drew strength from them. She started slowly, just testing the keys, trying to find a rhythm. The audience leaned in, curious but skeptical. Some of the young patrons whispered to each other, barely hiding their amusement. "I bet she mess up in a few seconds," one said, giggling. Others nudged each other, waiting to see a spectacle unfold. She could feel their eyes on her, judging, doubting, expecting failure. Her nervousness lingered, but beneath it was a quiet determination. She reminded herself that she wasn't doing this to please anyone, and she wasn't doing it for applause. This was her music, her expression. Slowly, she pressed down on the keys and began to play a few soft notes, just enough to test the acoustics and her own confidence. The sound that came out surprised even her, clear, deliberate, and smooth. The audience shifted slightly, noticing that the first notes weren't the awkward stumble they had expected. Some eyebrows went up. A few people exchanged surprised glances, but many still laughed quietly under their breath, not ready to admit that they might be wrong. A man at the back whispered, "Well, maybe she's okay, but I'm sure she'll mess up soon." Others nodded, still smirking. The cafe had started as a place for casual fun, but now the tension was different. There was a mix of doubt, curiosity, and quiet anticipation. She felt the laughter and doubt like a weight on her shoulders, but she didn't let it stop her. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she had practiced enough, that she knew what she was doing. Slowly, she began to play a simple melody, gentle at first, with soft chords that filled the small cafe. Her hands moved with precision, each key pressed carefully yet with emotion. The sound was honest and unpretentious. Just like her, the crowd's laughter didn't stop immediately, but some people began to pause. The gentle melody caught their attention, even if they didn't want to admit it. A few heads tilted as listeners tried to make sense of the sound. It wasn't just random notes. It was music that carried feeling. Her nerves didn't vanish, but they turned into a quiet focus. She felt herself sinking into the rhythm, letting the music guide her, letting it speak instead of her words, but not everyone was convinced yet. Some patrons still whispered behind their hands. "She's just warming up," one said. "She can't possibly know more than a few notes." The smirks and stifled laughs were still there, waiting for a mistake, waiting for a moment when she would stumble. She could hear them, but she tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the keys beneath her fingers and the sound that flowed from the piano. Even with the skepticism surrounding her, something shifted inside the cafe. The more she played, the more the audience began to listen, even if only a little. Some people straightened in their chairs, leaning closer. Others stopped talking quietly to each other, their attention drawn toward her hands and the music she was creating. The soft sound of the piano, delicate yet confident, started to fill the room in a way that made it impossible to ignore. She wasn't performing to impress anyone, yet the music had a quiet power. Even those who had laughed at her at first couldn't help but notice that she wasn't just playing. She was expressing something real. There was emotion in the way she struck the keys, a story in every note, a feeling that seemed bigger than the small cafe. It was clear to anyone listening closely that this wasn't casual play. This was someone who understood music deeply, someone who had poured time, effort, and heart into this moment without ever revealing it before. Still, a few stubborn skeptics remained. They whispered among themselves, unwilling to admit what they were beginning to feel. "Maybe she's okay for a beginner," one said. "But she can't be that good," another insisted. Their doubt hung in the air like a cloud, but it was starting to crack. Even they couldn't ignore the clarity and emotion in her playing. With each passing second, her confidence grew. The initial fear that had threatened to paralyze her now became a quiet fuel. She could feel the energy of the room shifting, though most of it was subtle. Some faces were slowly losing their smirks. A few people were watching in complete silence, unsure how to react. She continued, letting her fingers glide over the keys, creating gentle but deliberate chords that resonated through the cafe. By the end of her first full passage, the audience's mood had begun to change. The laughter had mostly faded. Eyes were wide with surprise. The same people who had expected a spectacle of failure were now silently taking in her skill, the sound of music that was both simple and breathtaking. The moment was fragile, like the calm before a storm, but it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. The waitress paused for a moment, letting the last note linger in the air. She glanced at the audience, sensing the shift, feeling the weight of their surprise. Some were nodding subtly, impressed but unwilling to speak. Others were leaning forward, realizing that they had underestimated her completely. Even the host, who had called her up with a teasing grin, now watched with genuine curiosity. She didn't smile yet. She stayed focused, aware that the performance had only just begun. But inside, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The first part of her story, the first challenge, had been met. The mockery and doubt had not defeated her. She had faced it head-on and proven, at least to herself, that she could rise above the expectations and the laughter of the crowd. She took a deep breath and let her fingers hover over the keys for a moment, as if listening to the silence that had fallen across the cafe. The laughter and whispers that had filled the room earlier were gone, replaced by a tense, almost reverent quiet. Every eye was on her now, every ear straining to hear the sound she was about to create. She felt a mixture of nervousness and calm determination. This was the moment where everything mattered, the moment that could change how people saw her forever. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, but each one carried a clarity and precision that made heads turn. The music didn't stumble. It didn't falter. It flowed, gentle but confident, like water moving smoothly over rocks in a quiet stream. People who had been smirking and whispering moments ago now froze, unsure what they were hearing. The notes were beautiful, simple, and yet full of emotion. A few patrons exchanged surprised glances. "Did she really just—" one whispered. Another shook their head in disbelief. The jokes and doubts that had hung over her like a shadow were fading fast. It was as if the music itself was erasing the skepticism in the room. Even those who had expected a laugh now sat silently, caught off guard by the skill and emotion pouring from her hands. Her fingers moved faster now, more confidently, as if the piano had become a part of her body. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story. Each chord spoke of long nights of practice, of quiet determination, of a love for music that had been nurtured in secret. The cafe seemed to disappear around her. She didn't notice the whispers or the gasps from the crowd. She only felt the music flowing through her, the sound filling every corner of the small room. The audience was starting to react, though not in the way anyone had expected. People were leaning forward in their chairs, eyes wide with amazement. A few regulars who had teased her earlier were now silent, their jaws slightly dropped, unable to believe what they were hearing. Even the host, who had called her up as a joke, had stopped smiling. He watched intently, realizing that he had underestimated her completely. The music began to build, soft at first, then stronger, more commanding. She moved effortlessly across the piano, her hands gliding over the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who had spent most of their life serving coffee and washing dishes. Each note seemed deliberate, each pause meaningful. The atmosphere in the cafe had changed completely. It was no longer a casual night out or a small talent showcase. It felt like a concert hall, small but filled with the intensity of people who had suddenly been reminded of what real talent could sound like. Some patrons were holding their drinks tightly, afraid to make a sound and disturb the moment. Others had their hands folded, leaning in, completely absorbed. The earlier jokes and snickers had vanished. People who had doubted her now found themselves captivated. They didn't just see a waitress anymore. They saw someone with skill, dedication, and an extraordinary gift. She played a piece that was both intricate and emotional, the kind of melody that seemed to speak directly to the heart. There were crescendos that made people catch their breath and soft passages that made them lean closer, as if trying to hold on to each note before it faded away. The crowd's mood had shifted completely. What had begun as mockery had turned into wonder. People were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something rare, something they hadn't expected at all. A few of the younger patrons exchanged looks, unable to contain their astonishment. "I thought this was going to be a joke," one whispered quietly. "I can't believe she's this good." Another nodded, whispering back, "She's incredible. How does she do that?" Even some of the older regulars who had been skeptical were now leaning back in their chairs, shaking their heads in disbelief. As the music continued, her confidence grew. The initial fear that had gripped her as she sat down at the piano had transformed into a calm focus. She let herself feel the music, letting it guide her hands. Every note carried a piece of her life, her struggles, her dreams, the long hours she had spent alone practicing. Each chord told a story that words never could. By the middle of her performance, the cafe was completely silent except for the music. Even the faint sounds of cups clinking or chairs moving seemed to disappear. Every person in the room was focused entirely on her, mesmerized by the sound coming from someone they had underestimated just minutes before. The contrast between her quiet, humble appearance and the power of her performance was striking. It was a reminder that talent doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, surprising everyone who thought they knew what to expect. A few people began to whisper apologies quietly to each other. "I can't believe I laughed at her," one said. "I thought it would be funny, but this is amazing." Another nodded, shaking their heads slowly. "She deserves more than just a small cafe stage. She should be playing in concert halls." The murmurs spread quietly, a ripple of awe that no one could ignore. She played on, each piece more beautiful than the last. The music had a way of touching people's hearts, even those who had come with the intention of mocking her. They were now captivated, moved, and even a little ashamed of their earlier judgment. Some people had tears in their eyes, moved not just by the skill, but by the emotion that came through every note. She wasn't performing to impress anyone, yet somehow she was reaching them all, making them see her for who she truly was. As the last notes of her piece lingered in the air, there was a moment of stunned silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The cafe felt frozen in that instant, as if everyone was holding their breath, processing what they had just witnessed. Then slowly, the audience erupted into applause. It started with a few claps, hesitant at first, and then grew louder, stronger, until the entire cafe was cheering. People were on their feet, some clapping, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The waitress sat at the piano, smiling softly, her fingers still resting on the keys, feeling a mixture of relief and quiet pride. She had faced the doubt, the mockery and the judgment, and she had risen above it. The crowd, who had expected a joke, had been completely stunned. They had been wrong to judge her by her job, by her quiet demeanor, or by the fact that she worked in a small cafe. In that moment, she wasn't just a waitress. She was a musician, a storyteller, and a reminder to everyone watching that talent can appear in the most unexpected places. The applause echoed through the cafe, bouncing off the walls and lingering in the air. At first, it was quiet, hesitant, almost like people were testing the waters to see if this was real. But as soon as the sound of clapping spread, it grew louder, stronger, until the small cafe felt like a concert hall. People stood up, some clapping so hard their hands ached, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Even those who had been mocking her earlier could not stop themselves from showing respect. She looked up from the piano, her eyes scanning the crowd. Faces that had been skeptical, teasing, or outright dismissive were now filled with surprise and admiration. Some people were leaning forward, mouths slightly open, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. Others were whispering quietly to each other, unable to contain their amazement. "I can't believe it," one person said softly. "She's incredible." Another nodded, almost in awe. "I thought this would be funny, but it's amazing." The transformation in the crowd was remarkable. People who had come to enjoy a casual night out, some even expecting a bit of entertainment at someone else's expense, were now completely absorbed. Their expressions had changed from smirks and jokes to wide eyes, silent admiration, and even tears in some cases. Her music had broken through the walls of doubt and judgment that had filled the room, and it had touched every person present. Some of the regulars who had teased her earlier were now quietly apologetic. They realized how wrong they had been to judge her by her appearance or by her job. One woman whispered to her friend, "I feel terrible for laughing at her. She's a genius." Her friend nodded, her eyes still fixed on the piano. "I know," she said softly. "We were so wrong. This is something I'll never forget." The Waitress continued to play, and with each passing note, the audience became more entranced. There was a rhythm and flow to her music that seemed effortless. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was telling a story, sharing a piece of her life, her struggles, and her dreams through each melody. The notes carried a depth of emotion that resonated with everyone listening. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, feeling a connection they hadn't expected. Even the host, who had called her up jokingly, now watched with awe. His grin had faded, replaced by genuine admiration. He whispered to someone nearby, "I didn't know she could play like that." "I really didn't know." Others around him nodded in agreement. The host's voice was low, almost reverent, as if admitting that he had been completely wrong. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted completely. It was no longer just a casual gathering or a talent night. It had become a moment of revelation. People were seeing her in a completely new light. She wasn't just a waitress serving coffee and clearing tables. She was someone with extraordinary skill, someone who had worked quietly and diligently for years, and someone who deserved every ounce of respect and admiration. A few patrons began to whisper about how incredible it was that someone with her life and circumstances could be so talented. "Imagine practicing all those nights alone, working so hard, and now look at her," one said. Another nodded, saying, "She deserves to be on a big stage. This is just unbelievable." These words weren't just about the music. They were about recognition, respect, and the realization that true talent isn't always visible at first glance. Some people were moved to tears. The emotion in the room was tangible, almost electric. Her music had reached a part of them that words could not touch. Even those who had been skeptical, even those who had come expecting a laugh, were now silent, caught in the magic of her performance. The quietest corners of the cafe felt alive with energy, with awe, and with respect for someone they had underestimated. The waitress didn't rush. She allowed the music to linger, letting every note speak its piece, letting every chord carry emotion. She could feel the energy of the room, and it fueled her even more. The nervousness that had gripped her earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by a quiet confidence. She knew she was doing what she was meant to do. She was sharing her gift, and the world, even if only a small cafe full of people, was finally seeing her for who she truly was. People started to clap again, some shouting words of encouragement. "Bravo! That's amazing! You're incredible!" The noise filled the cafe, almost drowning out the music, but it was a good kind of noise, celebratory, respectful, and full of admiration. Some patrons even approached her after the first piece, offering compliments and apologies at the same time. "I can't believe I laughed at you earlier," one said. "You are so talented." "I'm so sorry." She smiled politely, nodding, but inside, she felt a warm sense of validation. The emotional transformation was not just in the audience. It was in her as well. For the first time, she felt seen. Not just as a waitress or someone humble and unnoticed, but as a musician, as a storyteller, as someone who could touch lives with her art. Her heart swelled with pride, not arrogance, but quiet, deep pride. She had faced doubt, mockery, and judgment, and she had emerged stronger and more confident than ever. As she finished her next piece, the audience erupted once more. This time, the applause was louder, more heartfelt. People were standing, some with tears in their eyes, some shaking their heads in disbelief, some smiling broadly. The cafe, once filled with casual chatter and laughter at the expense of others, was now a place of wonder, respect, and admiration. Every person there had witnessed something extraordinary. Even the skeptics had been transformed. The ones who had expected a joke now clapped the hardest. Some were speechless, others were shaking their heads, unable to comprehend how they had misjudged her. The realization that they had underestimated someone based on appearance or job was humbling. They had laughed too soon, judged too quickly, and now they were learning a lesson they would never forget. The waitress paused, letting the last note linger in the room. The air was thick with emotion. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes, some were clapping uncontrollably, and some were simply sitting overwhelmed by the experience. She smiled softly, her eyes calm and serene, knowing that this moment was one she would remember forever, just as the audience would. In that cafe. On that small stage, she had done more than play the piano. She had changed minds, touched hearts, and reminded everyone that talent often hides where you least expect it. The crowd had come ready to laugh, to mock, and to be entertained casually. Instead, they were humbled, moved, and inspired. The transformation was complete, and there was no turning back. The final notes of her performance slowly faded into the quiet of the cafe, leaving a soft, lingering resonance in the air. For a moment, there was complete silence. The audience seemed frozen, caught between disbelief and awe. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that none of them had expected. People looked around at each other, as if to confirm that what they had heard was real. Faces that had been smirking, whispering, or rolling their eyes just minutes ago were now wide-eyed, filled with admiration and respect. Then the applause began. It started slowly, hesitant at first, as if people were testing whether this was really happening. But soon it grew louder, stronger, until the entire cafe was clapping, cheering, and calling out words of praise. "Bravo!" someone shouted. "That was amazing," another added. The sound was overwhelming, filling the room with a mix of joy, surprise, and awe. Some people were even standing on their chairs, clapping with hands held high. It was as if the cafe itself had transformed from a casual, ordinary place into a theater filled with wonder and excitement. The waitress sat at the piano, breathing deeply, her hands still resting on the keys. She smiled softly, not out of pride or arrogance, but because of the quiet satisfaction that comes from finally being seen for who you truly are. For years, she had worked in the background, unnoticed, serving coffee, wiping tables, and moving through life quietly. People had underestimated her, laughed at her, and assumed she was ordinary. But in that moment, she had shown them the truth. She was talented, she was dedicated, and her heart poured into every note she played. Some of the audience members approached her cautiously, their expressions a mix of awe and apology. "I'm so sorry for laughing earlier," one woman said softly. "You were incredible. I never expected—" "That," another man nodded, shaking his head. "I didn't know someone could play like that. I was wrong to judge." She smiled politely, nodding to each person, feeling a warmth in her heart. She accepted their words, not because she needed validation, but because she knew she had earned their respect through her talent and her courage. The cafe owner, who had watched the performance from the corner, approached her with a proud smile. "That was amazing," he said. "I had no idea you could play like that. You've brought something special to this place tonight." He handed her a small bouquet of flowers, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. It wasn't just about the music. It was about recognizing her effort, her dedication, And the way she had touched everyone in the room, word of her performance spread quickly. Some patrons took out their phones, capturing short videos of the piano and posting them online. Within hours, people outside the cafe were commenting, sharing, and expressing their amazement. Her story, her talent, and her courage to perform in front of strangers had struck a chord with many. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't sought attention or fame, but the recognition felt good in a way she had never experienced before. As the cafe began to settle, with people still whispering in amazement, she returned to her regular work, serving coffee and cleaning tables. But everything felt different now. She walked with a quiet confidence, knowing that her talent was real and that people now saw her differently. The shy, nervous feeling that had gripped her earlier had been replaced by a calm sense of pride. She realized that what she had done was more than just playing music. It was showing the world a part of herself that had always been hidden. Some patrons lingered, asking if she performed elsewhere or if she had other pieces to share. They were curious, eager to hear more of her music, and many even suggested that she should play on bigger stages. She listened with a quiet humility, happy to share a small part of herself with them, but also aware that her journey was just beginning. She had discovered something important that night. Her talent had power, not just to entertain, but to move, inspire, and change how people thought. As the evening drew to a close, she stepped outside for a moment, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The city lights glimmered around her, and she felt a sense of peace she had never felt before. She thought about the doubts, the teasing, and the moments of fear she had felt when she first approached the piano. And she realized something: those moments had not held her back. They had made her stronger, more determined, and more ready to embrace her gift. Her story didn't end at the cafe that night. The applause, the awe, and the recognition were just the beginning. People who had once overlooked her now looked at her differently. They had learned a lesson she had known all along: never judge someone by their job, their appearance, or the way they move through life quietly. Talent can exist in unexpected places, and sometimes it takes courage to show it to the world. In the days and weeks that followed, invitations began to arrive. People asked if she could perform at events, small gatherings, and even local festivals. She considered each one carefully, thinking about how she could continue to share her music while still managing her everyday life. The opportunities were exciting, but what mattered most to her was the realization that she had touched people's hearts with her gift. She had shown that determination, practice, and courage could overcome doubt and mockery. Most importantly, she had discovered a new sense of confidence within herself. She knew that she didn't have to hide her talent anymore. She could embrace it, nurture it, and let it shine. The cafe would always be a part of her story, the place where she first revealed her music to a skeptical audience, but her journey was far from over. She had learned that the world could surprise you, that people could be moved, and that even the smallest moments like sitting at a piano in a cozy cafe could change everything. That night, as she closed the cafe and walked home, she carried more than just the satisfaction of a good performance. She carried the knowledge that she was capable, that her talent mattered, and that she had the power to inspire others without even trying. People had come expecting entertainment, maybe even a joke, and left with a sense of wonder and admiration. She had turned doubt into respect, mockery into applause, and fear into courage, and so life continued, but everything had changed. She returned to her work at the cafe, still humble, still quiet, but with a new light in her eyes. Patrons who had once seen her as ordinary now looked at her with respect. Some would quietly approach, asking about her music. Others would linger, hoping to catch a note or two as she passed by the piano. She continued to serve coffee and clean tables, but she did so knowing that her gift had power and that she could choose to share it whenever she wished. Her story became a quiet legend in that small cafe. People would tell newcomers about the night the waitress sat at the piano and stunned everyone. They would recall the surprise, the awe, and the lesson that talent is not always obvious, and sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in the most ordinary places. She had shown them all that courage, skill, and heart matter more than first impressions, and in the end, that was what mattered most to her. Not the applause, not the recognition, not even the invitations to perform. What mattered was that she had believed in herself, that she had faced doubt and fear, and that she had shared a part of her soul with the world. That night the cafe had witnessed something rare, a quiet, humble person showing that extraordinary talent can appear anywhere and that it has the power to change lives, including her own.